Welcome to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. Today I'm joined by auctioneer Andy Reid to unpack what he's seeing on the ground in today's property market. We talk about the gap between sentiment and fundamentals, why buyers are hesitating despite strong underlying demand, and how that hesitation is quietly creating opportunities for those willing to act. Andy also shares his views on withdrawn auctions, the power of social proof, and where genuine value is hiding across both metro and outer suburban markets. If you're trying to make sense of the current noise and what it actually means for buyers, sellers, and investors, this one will help ground your thinking. Let's get into it. Andy Reid, thanks for joining me back on Geared for Growth.
Thank you for having me, my man. How are you?
I'm doing well. I mean, I'm a little bit busy. You might have been watching Canberra in the last little while. There's been all sorts of speeches, and at the time of recording,
Oh, really?
back end of May. Yeah. No, you need to turn your telly on, mate.
I didn't notice.
We joke. Yeah, of course we joke, but people talk about being at the coalface. You're a man who stands in front of houses with a gavel and sells them. 2 people, 4 people, all that sort of stuff. So, we want to know exactly what's happening right now. Give us the rub.
It's hilarious, right? Because the government have been bringing in or looking at bringing on all these changes, right, with a view to making it easier to buy property. Now, the analysis of all of these proposed changes are that it's likely to do quite the opposite. However, what I'm seeing at the coalface is that by accident, they've actually created the conditions that they've been wanting to create, but it's been purely psychological because of the amount of drama and chaos and bad news getting bandied around. And what I'm seeing are the conditions that they're banging on about, what they're trying to achieve. And then we're going to cock it up when all these measures come in.
Yeah, there's a gap between what will structurally happen to the property market that will take some time to resolve itself, and sentiment. And we are seeing sentiment right now today. So obviously we're on the same page that we actually see this as a short-term sentiment opportunity, because we've seen this play out before. We've seen it when there's been interest rate rises, war in Iran, GFCs, COVID. There's no shortage of people looking for an excuse to take the wait and see approach. What are you seeing right now with quality properties?
I'm seeing so many golden goose opportunities getting missed out on, getting passed up upon, right? They're getting passed on because whether it's because buyers feel like there's a narrative that makes them think that it is a buyer's market in the old traditional sense, or whether it is just through sheer paralysis, like analysis paralysis, right? Where there is that much information to try and disseminate that it's the car park analogy, right? Where if you've got one car park, it's easy to find which one you want to go to, but you got 15, you end up freaking out and deciding to shop tomorrow, right? And as a result of what's going on with the volume of information, the majority of which people are really struggling to understand even remotely, then I'm seeing so many good opportunities, like good, solid properties that are offering decent value, right? Reasonable value, that buyers are just stood there looking at each other, waiting for some social proof, i.e. waiting for someone else to bid, not seeing the social proof, and then walking off. And it's crazy because people are making decisions based upon everything that is outside of their own 4 walls, metaphorically speaking, right? It's mental, the amount of reliance that consumers have got at the minute on social proof to give them permission internally to actually do something is quite insane. When I could rattle off countless properties over the last 4 to 6 weeks that I've been in front of, looking at it, subjectively going, you know what, this is all right. This is pretty good value, this. And there's people there. It's not like there's any shortage of buyers. Buyers are there, the footfall's there, but they just walk away. And then although the clearance rate is suggesting that the market has weakened, you then go and just trot along a week or two after, and a number of these good quality value properties end up getting 2 or 3 offers on them, which then jams the price up more than what they could have got it for if they bought at the coalface of an auction.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because the media, of course, loves to talk auction clearance rates, which are really only relevant in Melbourne and Sydney. Those are the big auction markets. And if we look at what's happening in the property market nationally, Sydney and Melbourne have been, amongst the worst performers of any particular city. So it's pretty easy, it's pretty lazy journalism to sort of say, oh, the market's tanked because of auction clearance rates in 2 parts of the country that haven't been really doing well for years anyway.
No, totally, man. And I actually had a chat to one of said media outlets a few days ago, because it was off an observation that they made, because they'd been out to some auctions and seen loads of people and no one bid in and all the rest of it, right? And what the hell's going on, Andy? My sort of thought to them was that part of the challenge is the public perception of what a clearance rate represents in terms of market activity and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But it's also partly down to the practitioners treating an auction like the edge of a cliff, which it really isn't, right? I think I said this in our previous yarn on your amazing podcast, that my job as an auctioneer is to not drop the hammer. It's not to drop the hammer, it's to test the marketplace. And the goal of any vendor, is to make as much money as they possibly can out of the property in the situation. And so whether that is by going under the hammer or after the event in a negotiation, to me as an auctioneer is entirely irrelevant. I don't really care, right? Because my job, my focus is on helping an owner make as much money as they possibly can. So to really hang our hats on this clearance rate palaver, it's always been a little bugbear of mine. But the false nature of the narrative that it's creating in this current marketplace right now it's causing so many people to miss out on some stuff that would advance their lives tremendously.
That's the funny thing, isn't it? We're talking about something that could be walked back. I mean, the draft legislation has only just been released sort of minutes ago, as at the time of recording. We've got a potential election losing budget. That election can be called as late as May 2028. But all of this could be repealed. It could be walked back. And at the end of the day, these people buying property, they're not trying to get some 10-bagging investment like they're shorting Bitcoin or something like that. They're making decisions that are meaningful to them 10, 20, 30 years into the future, I'm guessing.
100%. And too much of the narrative, Mike, is based around cost, when realistically buying and selling decisions are not based off cost. They are based off worth and value, which is a very, very different conversation. A property, it's that old saying of there is a buyer for every property, right? There's always going to be a buyer for every single property, however good, bad, or ugly it is. Now, what that points towards is not the case. It's not a case of that every property has. It's a case of how that property represents as value based on the person that's looking at it, right? So when we talk about sentiment and all these sorts of things, one thing that just isn't talked about anywhere near enough is that simple truth that a property could be completely worth less to 9 out of 10 customers, but to that 1 out of 10 that sees exactly the same product with exactly the same metrics and exactly the same numericals, if it's a commercial or whatever, their perspective on those very black and white numbers will result in them seeing something be valuable versus something just being a cost. And we don't talk about that anywhere near as much as what we should. And in the public, in the media, in mainstream, in commentary, the volume to which that part of the equation affects the way that the economy ends up rocking and rolling, it's way more significant than anyone realizes. But because it's an intangible, because it's not a physical number, it gets dismissed. And all of this commentary and narrative is all done by people that they seem to like driving through with by looking at the rearview mirror. They're not that fussed about looking through the windscreen. They're too busy looking at the rearview mirror and thinking that they're not going to crash into anything, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose if we really need to consider fundamentals, and I would ask the question for anyone that's kind of thinking that it's a terrible time and the market's going to tank. You know, are we turning off immigration taps to zero? Are we likely to build 300,000 to 400,000 homes a year per year in the next three to 5 years? I think the answer to both those questions is a very, very obvious no, but people can't seem to sort of get out of their own way. I'm interested in who are the people that are selling right now. So are there people that are on the market that kind of thought, gosh, we're here now, let's just see what we can do? Or are you dealing with people that are actively deciding, look, we don't care about the noise of the market. This is our time. We need to move on. This is our decision. I'm interested in who the sellers are and who the buyers are and what sort of categorizes them at this particular point in time.
Essentially, they are the people that prioritize life over money, right? So essentially, and that FYI is the vast majority of the consumer population, right? Comparatively speaking, there are very, very few people, comparatively, that play in the marketplace because they're tycoons, right? The vast majority of the population operate their decision making based on something that their life requires, right? The vast majority of people don't just magically wake up one day and go, you know what, I fancy selling my house today, right? It just doesn't happen. Property for everyone, I'd say even the tycoons, property for everybody, it's not an end destination. It is a transaction that helps them to bring whatever it is they want to have achieve into life, right? So for all the vendors that I'm calling for, and all the and any buyer that I'm speaking to, really, they are all people that just want their life to move forward, right? And you talk about a pretty obvious statement, right? Which is economics 101, supply and demand. We all and throughout the budget, everybody kept saying there are more people than we've got houses for, right? That was uniform across the board, right? And so therefore, that's why we're doing X, Y, and Z. And so that was the one thing that they all pretty much could agree on. And when you've got basic economic functionality like that, there's always going to be a demand for property. Now, on top of that, though, there's this thing called life that people need to keep going with and keep moving through. And, just because a market's doing X, Y, and Z, a lot of people, for example, a lot of young parents, for example, that they will be way more concerned by making sure that their kid gets into a school as opposed to maximizing the return of their investment, right? The goal is to get the kid into the school, right? And whether that costs them a bit of money, they really couldn't give a monkeys, right? They really couldn't care less. And nor should they, because ultimately, if you're a parent of any worth, then that's what you're going to want to do. You're going to make sure your kid's sweet, right? And now, obviously, there is a degree of economic responsibility to this, which we can't ignore, of course. You can't just go, you can't just go through a caution to the wind. However, ultimately, I would argue for every human, whether they care to admit it or not, there will be certain decisions in life that take precedence over a profit margin. End of. And if you look at this commercially, right? You look at this commercially. There are buyers out there looking to procure warehouse space or whatever it is, right? That if you were to look at the economy, for any small to medium business right now, and there's a lot of conjecture over whether CGT is going to rip them a new one or not now, and all this sort of stuff, right? They are still looking at warehouse spaces because their ambition is turning the risk into a bet on themselves, right? They are not looking at it from a risk perspective. They are looking at it from the reward potential, right? Potential being the operative word here, because you can't see that on a P&L. But they were way more likely to act on that as opposed to something that some PM, that some bloody politician said on something on Sunrise, right? They will still operate off that as opposed to the logic, which, let's face it, there's hardly any of that going on at the minute.
No, from consumers and politicians alike, it sort of seems at the moment. When we talk about the situation that we're in at the moment, obviously we've got this knee-jerk reaction to what's going on. How would you contrast the market right now? Are there other periods where you're kind of going, oh, this feels a little bit like the first interest rate of the tightening cycle, or the beginning of the panic around the fuel supply issues, or is it about a bit like GFC? Is there anything you can point to give us a bit of a sense of where sentiment sort of feels like it's at the moment?
It actually feels a bit like COVID, because COVID was an external event that stopped everyone from getting stuff done, but the desire to get stuff done was still there, right? So that's what I would compare it to, psychologically speaking, is that their hesitation, the resistance, it's holding back a desire to want to transact, right? It's not like GFC, where people have just had the financial rug ripped from underneath them, right? It is way more, and obviously the difference is government restrictions on travel and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. But the psychological want to advance life and to move forward and to progress and all those sorts of things is still there. Hence why we are not short on a buying population. There are buyers still kicking around, rocking and rolling, right? The hesitation is not because of lack of want. And that's kind of like why I would equate it to COVID, right? And as soon as the first round of lockdowns finished in Melbourne, for example, in like that 2021 phase, there was a burst of activity. It just went whoop, right? It just went. Oh, it's like when you tell your dog, you go to feed your dog, and you tell them they can't go, and they sit there all patient, but they're twitching and they're itching and all this, and the plate of food's there, and like wait, go, and then they go boom, and they go wimmling in, and it kind of feels a little bit like that, to be honest, right? That's what I would compare that sentiment piece to.
That's an interesting observation, and I suppose there's as you mentioned, a lot of things different about COVID, and you guys did have a very protracted lockdown, but we came out of COVID with record sort of household savings rates because we couldn't go to Bali, we couldn't go out to dinner. The government shoved an unprecedented amount of stimulus to keep businesses afloat and to keep people in jobs and those sorts of things. And of course, we know what happened with COVID. Anyone that was sitting on the fence at that particular time that could have bought is probably now thinking, gosh, that was the time to buy. I wish I'd bought during COVID. Now, we probably can't expect the same sort of hockey stick stuff to happen as we did during COVID, but it begs the question, what sort of opportunities do you see right now? Is someone that's prepared to buy now in Melbourne, say, where you're active, getting a 5%, a 10% discount? I know it's hard to quantify, but what does it feel like?
It's going to be quite a soft word to say, right? And it's probably not going to give you a headline, but it kind of feels fair, which is odd, right? It kind of feels fair because the people that are willing to cross the whitewash and get into the game they haven't got as much competition around them from a buying perspective. And it's kind of creating a bit of parity between supply and demand in that sense, right? Where you've not got, stock is obviously still shy, but the number of buyers willing to act is also down. And so therefore it's actually a relatively even market where prices that are being achieved, generally speaking, are figures that where both sides are walking away going, yeah, I did okay. No one side essentially is going, ooh, I've done amazing, right? Now, there are, though, those situations with properties that are being on the market, and it's kind of a tale of two halves, because the properties that have been on the market for a little while, they are generally more committed to the sale and in many respects, they could be getting towards a bit of a D-Day, a bit of a red line moment, right? Where they need to make a decision on getting it gone. And that's where some buyers can really sort of take advantage in that regard. And there is some value in the market for the buying population if they're willing to take a punt, right? But one thing I was saying to the media reporters is, if I was a buyer, I would be looking at and looking out for any property in which the auction has been withdrawn. Right, so withdrawn with the number of properties that have been withdrawn from auction as a percentage has increased quite steadily.
Yeah,
and what that screams of, right? For me, it's a cardinal sin. As a practitioner, it's a cardinal sin, and it's not because I don't get paid, because I get paid regardless. Just for the record, right? The reason why it's a cardinal sin is the message that it sends out, right? Because a withdrawn property sends out a message that either the agent has priced it at a level that's just too far away from vendor expectations, right? The agents, bless them, they don't have complete control over the process, and therefore they get worried that it might make them look bad if it doesn't sell under the hammer, right? And that's what they're worried about.
Yeah.
Or the owners are hitting the panic button, right? They're hitting the panic button. And so withdrawn properties represent a really cool little sort of opportunity there based on the psychology of what's probably going on behind closed doors. So if I was a buyer, I'd be looking for that. But one big thing, like if you don't have a go, you'll never know, right? What's the worst that can happen? You put an offer forward, they say no, well, you move on. But and this is the thing, the thing that is contributing towards the anxiety, which is just not true, is that they feel that if they cross that whitewash and get into the game, they're committed to being in the game. As a buyer, you ain't, right? You don't have to. You don't. If they say, nah, but you offer 900 grand for something, and they come back and offer you and say, look, you can have it for $1 million, you can always just say no, right? Yeah. But the number of people that are not just taking a chance, knowing there's that much legislation and red tape nowadays that it protects your interests like there's no tomorrow. So the actual opportunity here for buyers is that if you don't ask, you'll never know. But if you ask and find out, you might be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a really good insight, because a withdrawn auction is obviously a deviation from the plan, and that plan has to take shape, and they have to present the case to the vendor to say, here's why we think it's an auction. And whether it be the sales agent or the vendor, somebody is panicking for that to withdraw. They either think it's overpriced, or they're petrified that nobody's going to show up, it's going to get passed in. And sure, as you mentioned before, properties can transact when the hammer doesn't fall, and in fact sometimes that's a better outcome, but they really want to avoid that, and they're disproportionately nervous about that happening.
The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Absolutely. Now, here's the flip side to that, right? Now, if in the last couple of months, if I was to listen to to the agents that I work for, and if what they think was going to happen at auction, if all of that was true, and if everything that they said was going to happen actually came to pass, my personal clearance rate would probably be around like 20 odd percent, right? And here's the flip reverse to that conversation. The auctions that go ahead don't assume because the clearance rate is low that it ain't going to sell. The amount of properties that have sold under my hammer where we went into it with the agent going, there is no chance that this is going to sell. My clearance rate is actually hovering just in around 70%. Because of the stuff that's happening on the day that agents could never have seen. It's not through lack of professionalism. It's literally because they're getting so much less information and intel from buyers that they're like, I don't know. In Melbourne, this is happening a lot more because obviously we don't have to register our bidders, right? So obviously this narrative is slightly different in other parts of the country. But the assumption that the numbers are going to give you a reality that matches those numbers, it is such a big mistake. Because, for example, 2 weeks ago, I had 2 auctions in which one buyer who was next door buying for mother-in-law, right, in the neighboring house, she decided to not bid any further because it wasn't on the market. The property passed in to the highest bidder that wasn't her. It got sold to the highest bidder, and then she burst into tears, the chick next door, right? Because she was doing the thing that apparently is going to put them in a good position, right?
Yeah.
And then she started trying to blame me. I literally I elongated that window of opportunity out by about 10 minutes, almost without a bid, right? It's a good job I got a dodgy accent, Mike, because then it means that people just get enamored by it irrespectively, right? Now, the next auction, there was this lad that was giving me the aura of know-it-all, right? Shaking his head, huffing, nah, 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 all that sort of jazz. The typical body language that we get accustomed to at times. He walked off because the auction didn't get a bid, and we passed it in on we pressed pause on it and opened negotiations up with a vendor bid. 2 buyers, one buyer walked in as they were walking out, another buyer walked in as I was walking out, and then a little sort of pseudo bidding war ensued, and it got done. And then this lad was left outside with egg on his face, right? The key thing to all of this is understand that there are parts of the legislation that are there to help seller and buyer, right? The reserve obviously is the comfort blanket, right? And understanding that you can alter your reserve according to the situation that's in front of you and so on and so forth. That's really, really critical. But on the buyer side, that right to negotiate is worth its weight in gold at the minute. It's worth its weight in gold. And if the ones that are going to get ahead are the ones that pay attention, go to stuff, see something about to pass in, and just nip in and win that right to negotiate, right? Because then what happens is you've got the undivided attention of a vendor that is so much more appreciative and understanding of the marketplace, and therefore are way more likely to come to the party. Hence, fair.
Yeah, to not bid because it's not on the market. Well, sure, but you want to be first in the door to negotiate on an asset where the owners had to witness potentially. Like most of the time, I assume the owner is there and just watching their hopes and dreams potentially slip away as it doesn't get anywhere near the reserve. You want to be the first person in that door to sort of say, look, obviously the appetite at that price isn't there. We're serious, but we're going to need to move on the stuff. Like when are they going to be more willing to have that conversation than right after a failed auction? Like an advocate would have saved that lady. She would have said, that's a silly decision. Let's bid. It's not on the market. It doesn't make any difference really anyway. Let's get first in the door and see what we can do.
100%, man. And I think where advocates have now, they've now got a big problem in terms of credibility at the minute, because there's been a huge explosion in the advocacy scene. That, and we could talk about that separately, but like,
It's another show.
the number of half-cock efforts that are out there from an advocacy perspective, I could tell you some horror stories around that, right? So I can understand why there are buyers that are still very apprehensive about it, because there are some shocking stories, right? Like I've had to, like as an auctioneer, because and this is going to make me sound quite arrogant, but I probably, in fact, I don't care, because ultimately I care about my craft, right? I've had to help out buyer advocates, when it came to the bidding process at auctions that I'm the auctioneer at during the auction, because I feel sorry for the advocate.
Right. And probably even more so sorry for the client that they're representing.
Oh, hey.
Expected that when they pay money, they get an expert, right?
And they end up being a bit like a deer in the headlights. And I'm telling them, right, no, you wait for a minute, now bid, now it's your turn. I'm telling them what to do while I'm in the auction, doing it while I'm rock and rolling, talking for everybody else as well. So that's a side note. I would like to give you one more observation that I think you might find interesting, though, Mike, if that's okay. Is
Please.
the number of I found it's brilliant. So in every metro area, there will be areas that have that garnered reputation over decades as being holes, right? As being the rear end of metro, right? The least desirable pockets, right? There's an agent that I work for in one of said pockets of Melbourne, right? And every time I go to one of his auctions, I'm always getting Sydney investors on the blower, or I had been until, some of this budget stuff's kicked in. Right. But up until just then, loads of online bidders all the time, advocates almost all the time. And I'm like, that's interesting. Yep. And then I paid attention to it, right? Now, for Melburnians, they would never buy in an area like a St Albans or a Broadmeadows or somewhere around there, right? However, statistically speaking, if you're looking at it not knowing what their reputations are, you are seeing suburbs that are max 15 minutes from Tullamarine Airport, max 15 to 20 minutes from the CBD, and you can still buy a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-car family home on mid 500 square meters of land for around about 650, 700 grand. Right?
It's cheap to Sydney siders, and it's cheap to most of the country.
Mate, it's cheap to Melburnians, but because of that inherent reputation that those areas have, they wouldn't touch it with a barge pole, right? Now, I'm fanboying over a chap who's very, very well regarded in the marketing world at the minute. And he made the observation, he goes, instead of like the main reason that buyers are struggling to buy right now is because they're trying to buy in the areas that everybody else is trying to buy. And as a result of that, they're having more competition. He said, so for example, buyers in London, for example, because he's over in the UK, they will not want to buy next to or near to a train station. And yet they need to live in that area because it is a commutable distance from where they are to city, right? To get to work and what have you. Now, you can't buy in the area that they're wanting to buy in, so therefore they have to go like 3 or 4 stations further out. But then there are properties that are around that train station, and I'm looking, and if you look at it in terms of what it does offer instead of what it doesn't offer, you will see a property that means that you don't even need a car to get to the train station. It saves you time and allows you to buy in an area that that normally you wouldn't be able to buy. And if you look at Metro and you look at the number of first-home buyers that claim that they can't buy, well, you can. You just can't buy in the market that you want to buy in, right? You can buy in Metro. You just got to go to a different bit, right? And so the observation that I'm making here is that there are everybody's looking for the next big thing, right? But a lot of the big things have been there for decades already. They've just not been picked up. And so
in plain sight.
Oh, it's ridiculous. It's mental. It's absolutely mental. Because if you look at those areas that I mentioned before, like if you look at the statistics of them, every day of the week and twice on a Sunday you buy them. And it's only through reputation that people don't of a suburb, which when you think about volume of immigration, number of new residents, all these sorts of things, the washing of these reputations, reputations are almost redundant now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
The events that caused the reputation might have been 70 years ago and the participants are all dead, you know?
Exactly. They've all pissed off. So there are some crazy opportunities that I love that saying, that are hiding in plain sight. And it's taking observations, it's taken perspectives from outside of the ecosystem to really highlight that on the front line, down here in Melbourne at the very least, but I'm sure there'll be spots all over the country.
Yeah, there's still opportunity out there. I want to, obviously before we close, I want to finish with some of your sagely advice, because you've been a very calm voice of reason in a time where I think the marketplace needs it. But how have you observing the investors at these auctions? Some initial reports are that these first home buyers that are at these auctions are now not competing with investors in the way that they used to, because investors are, obviously panicking, sitting on the sidelines and waiting what they're going to do next.
Investors can't just go windmilling in a haphazard manner anymore, right? So investors went through a phase where they'd just go and buy, right? Because the surface level value is sufficient to validate them transacting, right? What's happened now is that, and it's interesting because for a long time, because of cost to build and supply logistics and all this sort of stuff, making things a lot more expensive in terms of the hammers and nails and whatnot. A lot of the old stock that is subdividable potentially is getting shied away from, right? Now, because of the noise of stuff that could or could not happen, a lot of investors that was perhaps just more interested in a straight up and down investment, because a lot of these advocates are really hammering social media, saying, just get this investment, set and forget. They're really focusing on the set and forget type investments, right? But now potentially can't really do that anymore, right? Because of the extraneous nature of CGT, potentially. So investors are having to think a little bit more about, right, which properties are out there that could how quickly can these potentially become a positively geared asset if they are an established joint, or how can I transform this into a new build opportunity, right? So and this is where I actually think that it's actually, the negative gearing component of it, there's big chunks of it that I actually don't mind. Because I really don't mind it. And I actually do think that will help those first home buyers because of the fact that investors, they just won't see the viability of them. They just won't stack up because the growth just won't be sufficient. I actually think that's a cool thing in many respects. Now, obviously, those first home buyers that perhaps sometimes rely on that negative gearing component to buy that first home and then, and then move into or whatever, however it's set up. I get that that's a concern. And obviously, for a lot of those investors, you'll see some of them ship off into the sunset, right, before July 1 next year. And that might, again, cause rents to rise, which might cause more dramas in that respect in terms of saving. But investors are now looking at those subdividable projects and kind of sort of sticking their fingers in their ears a little bit about how much it's potentially going to cost them to build, But one thing I will say on that is that I am hearing quite a lot that there are more and more municipalities, more and more councils that are working really hard to make it easier for to actually process subdivisional projects, utilizing AI to calculate viability and all those sorts of things. And they're really working hard to streamline that effort now, because they need to try and remove as many barriers as they can that are causing a slowdown in the development of these properties, right? The property volumes. So the squeeze is on them now to actually try and make life easier to subdivide and stuff, which is good because that's in line with government policy. So I'm finding that that's what's happening with them. They're looking at it and going, right, because a lot of investors, it's kind of an addiction for a lot of them, right? They kind of get hooked on it. So they kind of need to satisfy that curve. And I think that they are finding reasons to reason with those extra costs to build.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting insight, and I wondered whether there would be investors looking at these opportunities to build new dwellings that may have the negative gearing allowances to them. Interestingly, you can't knock down an old one, apparently,
No.
and build a new one, but you can knock down an old one and build a duplex. You can buy a vacant block and build a new one, or subdivide a vacant block, build a new one, but you can't do it with a granny flat. This sort of came from the initial Treasury papers, but it's not in the draft legislation that I can see. Apparently, that's kicked down the can for a little bit later. But those are some interesting insights. But to finish, mate, for people that are they have a plan, they have a strategy. Our plan is to upgrade our owner occ. Our plan was to buy a first home to occupy in, or a plan was to buy a property in the next 6 months because that fits with our investment strategy. What advice would you have for those people that had a plan and they're now in this situation?
Deal in reality, right? Don't deal in what ifs. Deal in what's actually going on. Right, we tend to get paralyzed by these what if conversations, right? Well, what if this happens? Well, what if that happens? Well, what if things don't happen? Right? We're already seeing it. We're already seeing backflips and a whole bunch of this stuff, right? You know what I mean? Like Labour backbenchers sticking the pressure on bloody Albanese in a big way right now because of half the stuff that probably doesn't align with their own personal lives. So therefore, they're going to try and be for the people. Bless them. Some of them are, I'm sure. But the one thing I would say to all these people that think that their plans to advance their lives have been completely blown up and destroyed is that, and this is going to sound really airy-fairy, Mike, right? And I'm sorry, but it's the easiest way of saying it. Unless I'm mistaken, when we wake up in the morning, the sun's going to rise, right? And it's going to set. It's going to set tonight. And it's going to rise tomorrow. And we're going into the colder months of the year, right, down here in Australia. But I'm pretty confident that it's going to warm up again in a few months' time, right? I'm pretty confident, right? You couldn't pay me to go back to England just for that reason alone, right? So this sounds very, very altruistic. And yes, there are economic, like I said, fiscally responsible decisions that you need to sort of pay attention to. Of course, you can't just go peeing in the wind. But there is always going to be another day. There is always going to be another situation. You think that this is bad now, and when it calms down, you think we're not gonna be faced with another one of these again. Like, if you've learned nothing else over the last few years, is that life in the world are going to find ways to throw curveballs at you, and the last thing that you can do is end up basically putting yourself at the mercy of all of these things. You can only control what you can control, and I know that is cliched and very, very, very overused, but I don't think it's been more prevalent than what it is right now, right? A lot of the time, if you line up 100 people and you ask them what they're really worried about, I would argue that 99 out of 100 will be worrying about stuff that they can't have any effective control over, right? And yet there is a whole bunch of stuff on our doorstep and in our ecosystem and in our lives that are at the ends of our fingertips, and that we have got an influence over and an ability to control, that we're completely overlooking. I'm a firm believer, Mike, in taking full accountability for everything that's happened to me and for me and by me and with me, right? The sense of freedom. I was chatting to a business owner about this very topic earlier today. And the sense of freedom that brings is quite incredible, because if you spend your life and your time and your decisions not doing stuff and blaming other people for not doing stuff or other things, you'll never do anything. And then you're just going to get to the end of your life regretting a whole bunch of stuff that you wish you would have done. Kind of like what you mentioned about COVID earlier on, right? Humans have got a real habit of having an extremely short memory. And the one thing that I put it out on my social media in a manner of speaking is that the worry is always worse than the reality. Always. Because our brains are wired to plan for the worst, right? They are danger spotting machines that will do everything to avoid danger, right?
Yeah.
If you think back, Mike, to the last time that you potentially had a really crap scenario, and then play that out to when it actually came to pass, the vast majority of the times where those situations came to pass, the first thing that most people feel is relief.
Yeah.
Because the reality is ensued. So if you're looking at advancing your life, don't think that you can't. But just take accountability for what you can control and then make it happen another way. Because in any market, in any environment, there's always winners and losers. And you have got a choice which one you want to be, according to where your life is right now. Winners and losers, by the way, aren't defined by those that make squillions and those that make donuts, right? Like winners and losers in your life, it is totally based on where your life is now. If you want to win, you can win according to where your life is now. But having the calmness of taking accountability for what you can control, for me, that's probably step one before you go tapping any bloody calculator.
I think that's very, very wise advice, mate. And you've dropped us off on the train to all stations sensible. We've stopped off at some good points along the way, and yeah, really interesting to hear what you're observing and what your actual thoughts are based on those observations. And as you say, and a really good quote, the sun will rise and set tomorrow, and most of us will do anything we can to live in a place with a roof over our head. And there's already a shortage of those. So we're not going to be expecting doom times anytime soon. So if it's part of your plan, do your numbers, be sensible, of course, get the right advice, but carry on, because the universe doesn't know that there's a CGT legislation in the Houses of Parliament right now.
Mother Time has no mercy. Mother Time has no mercy, right? We're spending so much time fretting over stuff that either doesn't exist at the minute, might not ever exist. And yet that time is the one thing that is like an hourglass. We ain't going to get to turn that hourglass over, right? So maybe we should actually pay attention to it. And that's why life decisions will always supersede economical ones, because life decisions are always going to be underpinned by time. You can always make more money. Can't make more time. So stop wasting it.
True. Love that, mate. Andy Reid, thanks for joining me back on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. It's always a privilege, my friend. Thank you.